clarify, the group who's actually organised this meeting tonight is Uranium Free New South Wales, who are a group of people based in Sydney that are just concerned about the direction that is, New South Wales is currently heading in. And the issue around the particular proposal here in Dubbo and the fact that uranium exploration licences have now been granted or put out by the New South Wales government, and this is one of the areas that we thought, and the group thought it was good timing to actually have an information session prior to this Zirconia mine project going to Planning Assessment Commission, which is happening on the 4th of November. So originally for this meeting, I'm going to give a bit of background, and I'm sure quite a few of you are fully aware of the details of this proposal, but I'm just going to give you a little bit of a refresher and where things are up to in the planning process and how the planning process works. We start by giving a bit of background to myself, because the whole business of uranium prospecting being opened up in New South Wales is a little bit like Groundhog Day for me. In the 1980s, I suppose I really first got active on any social issues with the issue of uranium mining and nuclear weapons. And so the first group that I ever really joined was called People for Nuclear Disarmament, was a New South Wales group in the 1980s. And at the time we had Ronald Reagan and Khrushchev with their finger on the nuclear button, and we were all worried about nuclear war being the biggest threat to our existence at the time. There was also the issue of atmospheric testing of nuclear weapons, so there was a big campaign in Australia to prevent the atmospheric testing in the Pacific. But the Chinese actually continued atmospheric testing right up to the 1980s. And of course we had France still testing under Mururoa Atoll. So the whole issue of weapons testing and the nuclear industry was a big issue in the 1980s. And at the time there was a strong group called the Movement Against Uranium Mining, which was a national group. But here in New South Wales, that group was actually behind the New South Wales government in 1986, actually banning the exploration and mining of uranium in New South Wales. So that ban has stayed in place in New South Wales until 2012, when the current government overturned the ban on uranium exploration, but are saying they're maintaining the ban on mining. So why would you bother exploring for it if you couldn't mine it, is the big question now that everybody's asking. So the real problem with uranium mining, there's a range of issues around the whole security issues with uranium products. And as we know, the last Iraq war was started on the premise of the Iraqis having weapons of mass destruction. So there was concern. And while we've got the current federal government debating whether burqas are allowed in Parliament because of terrorist activity, the real threat to our security really is terrorists getting their hands on uranium material, nuclear materials. So the mining and selling of uranium is participating in the possible use of it in weapons. And then there's also the issue of the safety of the nuclear industry. We've had the history of Chernobyl, Three Mile Island, Windscale, and more recently Fukushima. So there's a whole issue of the storage of nuclear waste. So it's not a cheap industry. The environmental and social impacts of the nuclear industry are quite large. We know that uranium is hazardous to health, and there'll be a bit more on this later. Gavin will cover that. And it was predicted during the 1980s, at the times of the nuclear weapons testing and the haphazard dumping of nuclear waste, that there would be a worldwide increase in cancer And I believe 30 years down the track that actually is the case. So just to get down to the more specifics to this project, the Zirconia project at Toongi. Toongai, I thought Toongai, yep. So this project will produce uranium and thorium. And while Alkane, the proponent, repeatedly assures us that they're not mining uranium, their own report tells us that they are. So while they might not be selling uranium, they will be mining uranium with this proposal. So what their report tells us is that the world average for concentrations of uranium and thorium, so for uranium it's about 3 parts per million, and for thorium it's 6 parts per million. So the material that they're proposing to mine at Alkane, or at the Zirconia mine, contains 80 to 160 parts per million of uranium, 200 to 250 parts per million of thorium. And what these elements are, it contains the radionuclides, uranium-238, uranium-235 and thorium-232 and their decay chains. So the uranium-238 is the most common isotope of uranium. It's in itself is not fissile, which means it can't sustain a fission chain reaction, but after 2 beta decays it becomes plutonium. And it has a half-life of 4,460 billion years. Now the uranium-235 is fissile, so it can sustain fission chain reaction, and it has a half-life of 703,800,000 years. And the thorium-232 has been classified as carcinogenic. So these are some of the products that will be mined with this rare earths mine. So just some of the key issues and some of the stats with the mine. While it's generally, the proposal is built as a mine, the processing plant on site is also, one of the major problems. So the project proposes to run for 20 years, plus 2 years of construction. It will disturb 808 hectares of land, and 562.8 hectares of this will comprise of tailings dams and waste emplacement. So the mine itself is proposed to be a 40 hectare hole of 5 to 32 metres deep. And the project proposes to mine up to 1 million tonnes a year of the ore to produce 75,000 tonnes of final product. It will need more than 4 gigalitres of water a year, or that's 4 billion litres of water, to process the ore and suppress the dust. And it will produce 7 million tonnes of salt that will be stored permanently on the site. And it will also produce up to 2 million tonnes of solid waste per year that will also be left on site. Now the project proposes to truck 360,000 tonnes of chemical reagents each year. These include sulphur, quicklime, caustic soda, soda ash, hydrochloric acid, salt, 44 truckloads a week from Victoria, and hydrous ammonia, aluminium powder, and a number of other minor reagents that are not identified. Now, many of these products are classified as dangerous goods. They're also planning to truck in 240,000 tonnes of limestone per year and truck out the 75,000 tonnes of moderately hazardous products, including zirconium products, niobium concentrate, heavy and light rare earth elements. And it proposes to generate 158 heavy vehicle movements per day. So the ore is to be extracted through blasting an excavator onto trucks. Nowhere could I find in the entire assessment report mention of the number of blasts per day or week needed to extract the ore. And the air quality report does not consider blast emissions. It considers dust from poor roads and stockpiles. While there's consideration of the radioactive materials being diluted in the waste material, there seems to be no consideration of the effects of the blasting of radioactive materials into the airshed. Now, the project tailings dams and waste emplacements have been renamed liquid residue storage facilities, solid residue storage facilities, and salt encapsulation cells. All this material will stay on the site and be rehabilitated by the end of the mine. However, the open cut pit will be left as a final void. And another 157.8 hectares comprising of the waste rock, solid residue and salt emplacements have been identified as being unsuitable landforms for future agricultural use. So the toxic legacy of the mine is not really adequately considered. A few other stats. The project will clear over 40 hectares of native vegetation, an impact on the habitat of 23 reptiles, including the nationally endangered pink-tailed worm lizard, and the Toongai population is recognised as an important stronghold of the species. 9 frog species, 117 birds, including 19 threatened birds, and 36 mammal species, including 8 threatened bats. So the area is highly diverse and contains one of the largest privately owned vegetation remnants in the Central West. Though the proposed biodiversity offset area is on the site of Alkane owned land around the mine and the processing plant. It is proposed to be permanently protected, but there is no mention of what mechanism of protection is to be used. So just to go into the planning processes, the approvals process for state significant developments such as mines is quite complex. And because there was substantial concern raised about the Zirconia mine and processing plant proposal, there is a review and a public hearing being held here in Dubbo by the Independent Planning Assessment Commission on Tuesday the 4th of November at the Dubbo RSL, and I'll talk a bit more about that shortly. But the terms of reference for the Planning Assessment Commission include paying particular attention to air quality impacts, including any exposure to radioactive material, water impacts, transport impacts, and long-term land use impacts of the project, including the suitability and feasibility of the proposed rehabilitation strategy. So that's something that everyone actually needs to be concentrating on when you're looking at this proposal, is they're the areas that the Assessment Commission has been asked to really concentrate on. So the Department of Planning has produced an assessment report, and that's gone to the PAC. And this is actually a very important document that everyone needs to look at. So it's on the PAC and the Department of Planning website. So this Department of Planning assessment report, they've recommended that the project be approved, but this isn't unusual. In fact, there's no record of the Department of Planning rejecting a mining project to my knowledge. However, just this week, the Planning Assessment Commission overturned 2 recommendations for coal mines and rejected the approval of the coal pack